Today on Ascend to the Great Books podcast, we continue Dante's Inferno and our journey through Upper Hell, which is characterized by the sins of incontinence, or rather those souls that had a disordered attachment to some good, like food, wealth, and even anger. Will then cross over the river Styx into the city of Dis, an infernal city that serves as the sixth circle punishing heretics, and serves as the antechamber to lower hell, sins characterized by malice. To guide us through the rest of Upper Hell, we are joined by Dr. Jason Baxter, who recently released his own translation of the Inferno. We'll discuss what led him to translate Dante and what he found most surprising in doing so, and then have an interesting conversation on Dante's great-great-grandfather being knighted in the Crusades and how Dante's chivalric blood informs his depiction of hell. Be sure to visit thegreatbookspodcast.com to check out our guide on Dante's Inferno, which has over 80 questions and answers to guide you or your small group through the text. And join us today for a fantastic conversation on the rest of Upper Hell. Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. I'm a husband, father of 5, and serve as the Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. We are recording on a beautiful evening here in rural Oklahoma. If you're new to Ascend, we're a weekly podcast that helps guide you through the great books. We are currently reading Dante's Inferno at a slow, attentive pace over the 7 weeks of Lent. Check us out on Twitter or X, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon. We appreciate all of our supporters. Also, visit thegreatbookspodcast.com. We have written guides to help you through the great books, including a reader's guide to Dante's Inferno, breaking down all the circles of hell and the information you need, particularly for first-time readers. Today, we have our 3rd episode on Dante's Inferno and are covering Cantos 6 through 11, discussing gluttony, avarice, wrath, heresy, and more. To help guide us through these circles of hell, we are joined by Dr. Jason Baxter. He is a director for the Center for Beauty and Culture at Benedictine College. He is also a speaker and author of 7 books, including A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Comedy, a new translation of Dante's Inferno, and most recently, Why Literature Still Matters. And you can find his popular writing on his Substack, Beauty Matters. Dr. Baxter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You also have another book too, right, that recently came out on C.S. Lewis?
I do. Yeah, it's called The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. It's also read rather magnificently by Simon Vance. I find myself just purchasing his readings of the Dallas phone book. He's such a good reader. So, I mean, he's a major upgrade for the book. But yeah, it's a lovely reading, and it was really fun to do.
Wonderful. Well, I have 2 of your texts right here in front of me, so I will hold them up that I just mentioned. So one, the Inferno, and so I read out of this one for tonight's episode. And then also A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy as well, which I also enjoyed reading the selections that were pertinent for tonight out of this. So kind of tell me, like, what led you to translate Dante's Inferno?
Yes. I'm a professor of the great books, and I've taught Dante a number of times. And I realized that it's very easy as you teach to slowly get into the habit of just teaching your talking points. And, there's a lot to read. People read really fast. You don't have finite time. And so I found, I could sort of get away with not talking about the difficult bits, like the Guelfs and the Ghibellines and exactly what battle Farinata is referring to and all this kind of good stuff, right? You just sort of leave that for the notes. And so I felt, look, I love this author. I love him like he loved Virgil. I feel close to him, but I want to be closer to the master. And so I thought, wouldn't it be cool if you could just translate this whole thing? And then you'd be like a kid at the piano, and at first you're sort of playing it, sight reading something, and very laboriously moving your fingers to correspond with what your brain sees. But then eventually you get it down well enough, you close the book and you close your eyes, and then you can play it, and it feels differently, doesn't it? It's, it's no longer in your brain. It's, it's in your pulse and it's in your veins. And so that was my goal, just to sort of draw close to the master. It was for me. But in the middle of the process, in the middle of the exercise, being forced to look at every single one of these little words, I became really fascinated with how, with, use a fancy term, the periodic structure of Dante's sentences. In other words, how he makes his sentences work, right? Is it more like Hemingway, or is it more like Charles Dickens, right? Is it these kind of like short, fast, quick sentences, like, Hemingway's, man in the sea, right? He came down to the sea. He saw the sea. He got into a boat. He went out, right? That's paratactic syntax, right? Or in contrast to that would be something like a sort of Dickensian sentence, which goes on for a whole page, right? Dante, as a young man, wanted to write with what he called a prolixitas, using a Latin word, but a sort of sense of slow motion, gracious slow motion, almost like a floating. He said that was the goal for poetry. And then all of a sudden he started writing this Inferno. And I started picking up on all these little conjunctions and these little adverbs when Dante says things like, and then, and then, and then, and then. And I noticed too that he was wrapping up a whole grammatical sentence within a single line, whereas the younger Dante would have allowed it to spill over 9, 10, 14 lines in that kind of Dickensian way. And so if the young Dante was trying to create this floating sense, this prolixitas, this gracious, ambling pace, all of a sudden this Dante of the Inferno is creating something which has a pace which is moving fast. And it struck me as something almost like a heartbeat. Or I guess you could put it another way, in our world of cinema, it struck me as his soundtrack, right? His sort of noir soundtrack to the background in order to try to create the atmosphere for this poem. And that's when I knew that this project was exciting, because it was overflowing, being merely a fun and good thing for me as a scholar and as a lover of Dante. But if I could capture that type of rhythm, some of my reviewers of the translation have called it an iconoclastic translation, right? But if I could capture that sort of noir feeling and the fastness of it, then I would help sort of restore the incredible energy of the original.
That's very beautiful. What is the as you kind of work through this kind of labor of love, anything that like surprised you the most that maybe you thought you knew about Dante but then changed, or something that you just didn't even know was there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, already what I've mentioned, that the sort of heartbeat and the pacing of it, right? His attempt to create this incredibly fast thing, that was a huge discovery about Inferno. I guess another one is, I think I sort of knew this, but I didn't feel it till later. Dante mixes registers in a really funny way. That is, he uses high registers and low registers in English. And I joke about this in the introduction to the translation. In English, if we're talking among our friends, we talk about our tummy ache and we complain about our brother and our sister. In other words, we use this sort of register of our Anglo-Saxon heritage. But all of a sudden we step into our therapist office or the doctor's room, right? We switch to this Latinate French thing. We refer to intestinal disorder and sibling rivalry. And so we have this sort of swapping of registers all day long. And Dante does something like that as well. But for him, it's particularly grating because he had made all these rules for himself, like don't use double Z's in your poetry and don't use double X's. They sound harsh and brutal. They sound like men, like cavemen. He says this kind of stuff in some of his earlier treatises. But then he goes and uses all this stuff in the Inferno. So that was super interesting to see that. But I suppose now that I know this is beyond what we're talking about for today, but now that I've got the Purgatorio in draft, there have been a number of things that I've been very surprised by, and it happened today. Actually, it was really cool. The last canto I've been sort of cleaning up is the one that I've been postponing, procrastinating on because I thought it was boring. It's Purgatorio 25. I guarantee none of your guests will even touch it. It's so boring. Statius is talking about, I jokingly call it medieval Discovery Channel, where babies come from, and it's all this weird Aristotelian biology about like how all these things happen, and it's super weird and it's really uncomfortable. And so I've been sort of dreading getting to this. But as I was reading it today, I realized, oh wow, I finally realize what he's doing here. And that was a sort of breakthrough moment for me, in which he's sort of describing the very human body and its constitution as related to the elements of the world. Thus, we're sort of built into this world capable of reading it, capable of loving it, and capable of responding to it, almost in a sort of Augustinian way, from caterpillars to supernovas. We've got, we have the capacity to bring it all into a sense of praise. Anyway, so there have been a number of moments like that for me, and I guess we'll get into it eventually. But another one of those kind of surprise moments for me was Inferno 9. I think that was a sort of breakthrough moment for me when I compared it to what happens in Virgil's Aeneid. Of course, that's a text that Dante knows cold. It's maybe one of 5 or 6 books that he can't forget. Maybe one of 5 or 6 books that he probably practically has memorized, right up there with the Consolation of Philosophy and a couple of Aquinas' commentaries and different books of Aristotle, but Virgil's book 6. So the fact that he rewrites a little chunk of Aeneid 6 at this moment is highly significant, especially given the fact that he himself says, "Hey, reader, you're paying attention, aren't you?" So those have been some of my sort of exciting moments where when I finally give, as you said, the attentive read that the master deserves, it's been richly rewarding.
I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I mean, Dante, that's the way we're approaching this, right? Is that Dante is the teacher. He's the one that we come before to learn these lessons. Yeah, I think that there has been multiple layers over the years when I've read this text. I mean, it's funny because in certain ways I feel like I really have a good grasp, like, oh yeah, I know what's going on in these cantos, etc. And then I come back and revisit it and I realize like, nope, there's whole layers here and kind of like strata that I still have not quite figured out what he's doing. And it's just amazing to me how much you can return to this text and like learn something true, good, and beautiful from it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it reminds me of what one of my friends said, right? That a mystery is not something. There are 2 types of mysteries. There are those which are puzzles, like a detective novel, and then you discover what's wrong, and then you figure it all out, and you never read it again. And the mystery that you keep going back to, because no matter how much you know about it, you haven't explained it yet. And I mean, surely that must be very close to the definition, or at least the experience of a great book. And how the heck an author achieves that is another super exciting question. But yeah, maybe it would take us too far beyond our Conti for today.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well, let's jump into the text. So let's look at the Canto 6, the third circle. So I guess that's like here on a high level, like who do Dante the Pilgrim and Virgil find here in the third circle of hell?
Yeah, the gluttonous, right? It's Dante finds Chaco. He finds those. Well, everyone, as is explained at length by Professor Virgil in Inferno 11, everyone who's outside of the city of Des, right, outside of those walls, which is what you could call deep hell, is in this higher up area, and they're there because they did not yoke their lower animal appetites, which are not bad in and of themselves. The sexual appetite, the desire for food, the desire for possessions, such that you can meet your physical needs. Right? Those sort of natural drives and instincts are not bad. But in Thomistic psychology, which seemingly orders the architecture of hell, what is bad is when those appetites are not controlled by reason. Why? Because they're like some, dumb horse that will keep eating until his stomach explodes, right? Those appetites are never satisfied, right? One, the appetites in and of themselves, right? Hunger, you just sort of keep eating and eating and eating and eating forever, right? You only have to go to a college campus for the weekend to walk around for 35 minutes to realize the party culture, right? There's no satisfaction to this, right? There's no satiation to these types of appetites. We do this every single Friday and every single Saturday, and also every single Thursday if we don't have Friday classes, right? So I think Chaco's kind of, among those types of characters. Basically, and I think this whole sort of gluttonous, it's not just people who, who go buy bags of marshmallows and cram them down in the car, right? Not just those types of people, but I think for Dante, it's food snobs, it's epicures, it's like snooty fine dining people, right? It's people who spend more money on a meal than high school English teachers make in a month. I think for Dante, basically, the gluttony is anytime, and he obviously he wouldn't have done it, but I think he'd probably put casual marijuana users in this category as well. But I think it's drinkers, it's party folks, it's frat life, right? And it's as well as sort of like snooty Epicurean type of people. Basically, it's anyone who wittingly or unwittingly places their beatific happiness in consumption of material goods, right? As I think I put it in the beginner's guide, those who can't do anything but look forward to the weekend, right? It's almost Saturday night. Or, oh, it's almost Saturday night. The new restaurant should be open, right? I hear they're serving, right? Again, none of these things are necessarily bad in and of themselves, right? Alcohol, wine, food, um, maybe marijuana cannot be done in any temperate way, at least in my feelings. But I think so. It's an intemperance of the appetite, but what it belies and what it betrays is a secret desire to find my beatific happiness in the consumption of material goods. And that's why, as Dante himself points out, right? Look, there might be punishments which are worse, but there's nothing more disgusting, right? It's this nasty rain, and it stinks, and seemingly like all kinds of gross bodily fluids, right? Which happens when we overconsume. It is absolutely sort of disgusting place. And Chaco sort of temporarily wakes up. But what I've found super interesting is that he seems to unplug himself. He seems like sort of Dante says, well, tell us, what is wrong with our city? And Chaco says, look, I mean, it's full of pride and envy and avarice. Of course it's ripping open like a sack that's spilling over. But as soon as sort of Chaco moves kind of toward the center of the heart, that kind of invisible wound, and begins to sort of touch it, he sort of jerks back and says, but we're done here. And then goes back out into oblivion. And that's always just seemed to me probably how he lived his life, right? Is that sort of constantly consuming materials in order not to have to deal with the inner wound, right? And so I think there's something super interesting here. It's not just the contrapasso is pretty obvious, isn't it? They're getting pelted by disgusting, stinky fluids, right? This is what happens when you overconsume things. If you drink too much alcohol, everyone knows how you feel and what happens next, right? If you eat 10 times more than you should at Thanksgiving, everyone knows how you feel afterwards, right? And so I think the contrapasso sort of slaps you in the face. Is so disgusting and obvious. But I think what's much more interesting is this sort of psychological comment on Chaco, who precisely as he draws near to this deeper wound, he's practiced his whole life at ignoring matters of seriousness, and like, well, let's not talk about that. That's the deep stuff. He never did it, and so here, now that he's in hell, he's sort of locked into almost like like a wax sculpture that you put a nickel in and it starts to talk to you. He gives the same thing and reverts back to his old habits because now he can't change.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, the contrapasso here, yeah, it seems like really clear. Other imagery that you kind of imagine when you're reading this canto is that they're like pigs. They're like wallowing. They have this like disordered relationship with food. And so I appreciate what you say there is what we're seeing kind of in this like upper hell, this area of incontinence, is there are goods here. There's food, there's sex, there's wealth. These are things that are not, evil in and of themselves, but rather these people have some type of disordered appetite, and therefore they've abused a particular good. And so, yeah, we see these souls kind of wallowing around. Dante the poet uses a lot of dog imagery. One of the things that we see here is Cerberus, right, the three-headed dog. And one thing I find fascinating, because the Dante's, as we've kind of talked about previously, Dante's Inferno tracks in a lot of ways the Aeneid, and so Virgil is his guide, and so there's these parallels. Well, when Cerberus has to be like satisfied in the myths previous to the Inferno, right? He's like fed like honey cakes and these things. Here, they pick
Yeah,
up
they're like magical. They're magical as well. Like they have magical
Mhm.
potion of soporific, right? Yeah,
Yeah, here he picks up like part of this disgusting mud, this
that's right.
slime,
That's
and
right.
feeds it to him to satisfy him. And it seems
That's
there, like
right.
if we take a step back and say, okay,
Right.
what is this an analog of? It
Yeah.
seems like what Dante the poet's teaching us there is that this consumption is irrational, right? It's like it's this irrational relationship with consumption and food.
Well, yeah, and everyone who's been around it, and I suppose almost everyone has been around it at least a little bit, knows that part of the whole kind of gluttonous mindset, which I really prefer to call party culture, because you call gluttony, we just think. I mean, our culture is like really worried about body images, right? And so we sort of, zero in merely on the kind of overeating thing. That's something we can get behind. But there are 100 ways to commit gluttony, right? But anyway, I just sort of think of it generally sort of party culture. Anyone who's been around party culture at least a little bit, you know that it's not just irrational, but it's a delight in the irrational, right? It's not just that I drink more than is healthy for a human being's, blood circulation, but I think that's hilarious. And I think it's great to drink, this X amount of, of of alcohol. It's great to almost get to blood poisoned alcohol, right? And there's this kind of like weird kind of exaltation in it. And I think Dante sort of almost felt it as a parody of bliss, of a parody of joy, right? I mean, Paul says that we should be inebriated on the Holy Spirit and be sober, right? A sober inebriation that is, if we're really flourishing as human beings, and we're sacrificial and we love people and we have eyes which are quick for love and feet which are quick to serve, then we have a kind of inebriation and we do have a kind of overflow. And that's what happens on, and party culture in general. And Dante calls it, gula. That's the Latin. That's what I wanted to name the ice cream store that opened up in my town. I wanted to call it gula, but they rejected it and chose something I think better for marketing. But in any case, I mean, I think that's what Dante sees is this kind of, again, not irrationality, but exaltation in the irrationality. Why? Because I'm taking this act of excess, and again, in a spiritual mode, there are certain modes of excess which are laudable and praiseworthy, right? Read the beginning of Augustine's Confessions, and you'll hear excess, except as excessive praise and excessive love, right? But in this case, it's an easy excess. It's a commodified excess, which you can go just pick up at a dispensary, for $17, right? I mean, true things, beautiful things, and rich things cannot be commodified in that type of way. But they also give a kind of sober inebriation, which is much greater. But these guys pretend that they got the real thing, and I think that's one of the funny things that's being continually acted out down here.
Yeah, no, well said. The before we kind of move on from this canto, there's a really interesting discussion at the end of the canto where Dante the Pilgrim is always asking Virgil these questions. He's trying to learn as he kind of in his journey downward. And one of the things he asks him here at the end is, how will the final judgment affect these souls? Because one of the things that I don't know if we've like fully realized as we've journeyed, but this is our flag to realize it, is that all these souls are disembodied, right? They don't have their bodies. So just like this quick sketch of like, Catholic theology here, when you die, you undergo a particular judgment. You stand before Jesus Christ and you are immediately judged. And so, you could go straight to heaven, you could go to purgatory and then eventually go to heaven, or you're going to go to hell. But everyone has this like particular immediate judgment. But you're disembodied. You don't have the bodily resurrection has not occurred. So then at the end of time, right, you think of like Matthew 25, all the nations are called before God. You think about the sheep and the goats and this kind of separation. Everyone is judged, but there's also part of that is the bodily resurrection. So it's interesting that Dante the Pilgrim then asked Virgil, like, well, at the end of time, in this kind of bodily resurrection, at the final judgment, not our particular judgment, but the final judgment, how will this affect people down here? My understanding is what Virgil tells him is, well, these souls down here will become more who they're supposed to be, right? We're composite creatures, we're made of body and soul. And so therefore the pain that they're experiencing, so say like the gluttons here kind of wallowing in this filth, their pain will be perfected, right? The contrapasso will be perfected in them, once they have a body.
Yeah. No, I mean, seemingly Dante's does what he always does. He's mixing together his favorite sources and trying to find like a scholastic. He's trying to find a synthesis of these things. And one of his sources are, of course, is Virgil, and Virgil calls the souls in the underworld. He calls them shades. And then he has these moments in which, of course, Aeneas tries to hug his father Anchises, and he goes right through him, right? So that's something that Virgil, of course, doesn't feel the need to be technical about it. But then Dante has his good Aristotelian psychology, right? But he also has a sense of Augustine's sign theory, in which one of the unique gifts of a human being is being able to express out here what I feel and hear. And thus my heart can talk to your heart by means of my words, but also even for Augustine, even more naturally, my gesture, my tone of voice, my expressions, right? My facial expressions, my laughter, my sorrow, my tears, right? And thus for Dante, a little bit of Aristotle, a little bit of Augustine, a little bit of Virgil, there's no such thing as a disembodied soul. Every soul has to have something of a body, even if it's tenuous and thin. And so here they have sort of bodies seemingly of air molecules. And they can feel with their air molecules, and they can do things, and they can walk around, and they can, be punished, like the awful punishments among the schismatics coming down later. But for Dante, I think it's a fascinating thing is that we're such sign using animals that we have to have some type of vehicle for signifying what's in the heart. And thus he comes up with this really interesting explanation that they're kind of airy bodies.
I like that. Yeah,
Shades.
I like that a lot. Let's push forward just a little bit to Canto 7, right? So
Yeah.
we're introduced, say, to the fourth circle. So let me kind of sketch this out as how I understand this, because it's kind of, I think, one of the most interesting and kind of fascinating pictures. We also start to get this theme of two different sins in the same area. And I think there's like a lesson there that we have to learn. So Dante comes down, they're in this fourth circle. They see Pluto right at the beginning. He has this kind of like language that they can't understand. I'd be fascinated if you had any comments on that. I think the first time I read it, I was very confused why Hades, right? Pluto was like here in the wealth section. It wasn't until I read Homer that I realized that because he's the god of the underworld, he's also the god of the earth and all of the precious minerals and jewels and gold and silver that are in the earth. So there's a
That's right.
relationship between Hades and wealth. And that was something I don't think I clicked the first time I
Right.
read the text.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, that's awesome. I mean, Lewis says that in Discarded Image. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an interesting image that wasn't immediately apparent to me. So they kind of come
Right.
over and they see this four circle, and there's two different groups. So they're forming an actual circle, almost like a wheel, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
and it's broken in half. And there seem to be two different groups, and they have these weights, these stones that they're rolling, and in these kind of semicircles, they'll roll, and in the middle they'll crash into each other, and they're accusing each other, right? They're yelling at each other, and they kind of roll the other way, and then they crash into each other. And so my understanding here is that we're dealing now in this fourth circle with a misuse of wealth, right? So if we're just leaving a disordered appetite towards food, now we're going into a disordered appetite towards wealth, and these two groups represent, the hoarders and the spendthrifts. Like, what can we learn about this section?
Yeah. I mean, at some point in my writing, I jokingly say it's like a presidential election which never ends, right? It's one group cannot think. It doesn't even have its own positive platform. Its whole campaign is those other guys are sick and perverted, right? That's it. And then the group B has the exact same campaign strategy. No, group A is sick and perverted. And all they do is talk about how sick and perverted this other group is, right? They're just absolute, oh, there they are. There they are, right? And so the groups sort of come, they clash. They're carrying the same sort of worthless things. They have the same platform, right? They analogously to the gluttonous who think that consumption of things is going to bring beatitude. These are those who either in one of two ways, either through type of reckless spending, and spending beyond my means, right? Purchasing elaborate things that I can't afford, not worrying about where it goes to on the credit card, right? Buying things for other people, the sort of like uproarious, gregarious, fun, but kind of falsely magnanimous spendthrift, right? Versus the other who's constantly checking his accounts and and his earning potential, and basically can't think of any interaction between human beings except in terms of financial. Obviously, it's sort of somewhat anachronistically bringing it up into our day. But these are the misers and these are the spendthrifts, and they just can't stand each other. But I think, yeah, you're absolutely right, Deacon. That the funny thing is that they share this thing in common, that they've placed their beatitude in material possessions, which now, of course, is symbolized by these big lumps of rock, right? Oh, you like stuff that comes from the earth, do you? Here's a huge lump of it. Push that around, and now that it'd be like someone in the middle of the desert still carrying around his briefcase of millions of dollars, but dying of thirst, and yet unwilling to let go of the money. Out there, it just means nothing. It's worthless. It can't do anything for you, right? And it's sort of analogously, in a sort of grander sense of the cosmos, right? The things that, as we'll learn in the Paradiso, right, the gems and the jewels of heaven, or of course the souls who have loved, and the sort of impressions and memories of sanctity. But these poor guys, both sets crashing into each other, can't see that. They just think that through wonderfully exaggerated spending, right? The thrill of that big purchase, or we all kind of get into this mindset, I think, especially in a kind of in a democratic capitalist society, right? We like work really hard, right? We measure our times, we count our steps, we measure our sleep, we work really hard on our productivity, and if we're really productive in this quarter, then we might be able to 10x it, and in the next 3 quarters, and then. But when the thing finally comes, when the promotion, when the goal is hit, it's just this big downer, right? The quantitative realities, again, not that they're wrong, right? I mean, I think we have to be prudent, we have to be smart, but I think what Dante realizes is that quantitative realities can asphyxiate us, because what we want is infinity. What we want is the qualitatively, and that which is unbound, that which is on fire, and that which is love. But these poor guys didn't know that in life, and now they get to act it out in this sad, pathetic, dramatically ironic play, which everyone but them can see.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, one of the things too, I mean, just to kind of build on what you said, what we're seeing here, and we're going to start seeing a theme, is that one of the things that, Aristotle will talk about is that virtue is found in the mean. And so when we approach goods, right, things like wealth or food or sex, right, there's a mean on how we're actually supposed to approach it. And so what we're going to see, like in this circle, is you'll have sometimes two different sins related to the same good, because one is like an excess and one is a defect, right? And so, one has too much of something, one has too little of the other, and it leads into how people can have a disordered appetite, towards the same good. One thing here, though, in the imagery overall that I think Dante's playing with, that as modern readers, I don't know if we're immediately aware of, but then obviously Virgil gives us this talk that kind of helps pull it out, is that, they make this wheel, and, they're attached to wealth. And so there's an imagery going on here of Lady Fortune. And so if you remember, like you already mentioned, right, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and you had Lady Philosophy, and she's often contrasted with Lady Fortune, who has this, literal wheel of fortune. Sometimes, you think you're doing well, and sometimes she just spins it, and she's capricious, and you don't know what's going to happen. Men spend their whole lives trying to seek a fortune, and this Lady Fortune can just turn it all upside down at a moment's notice. And so it's interesting because in Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, he seems very much to contrast these two women, Lady Fortune and Lady Philosophy, and why we need to gravitate and attach to Lady Philosophy, right? These perennial truths, wisdom, things that are stable, not this wheel. What really caught my attention here in this canto with Dante is that somewhat negative veneer that I would read Boethius has on Lady Fortune, and Dante seems to be gone, and now Lady Fortune, she's like an angel, right? She's an agent of God's providence, moving this fortune as God wills it. I mean, it's a beautiful image, but what has Dante done to Fortune here?
Yeah. Yeah, she's sort of giddy and almost like I've got one of these, a 7-year-old girl who's like, pulling off flower petals and just tossing them everywhere and running around in a circle, right? Like in her mind, like it's this kind of like incredible act of generosity, isn't it? Right? Like, here's more flower petals, right? But for her, basically they're not super, super important, but also it's kind of, it's kind of indiscriminate, right? It's just, I'll give you what I have as long as I have it. And thus it sort of falls as this type of blessing. But then, of course, according to Dante, right, we become sort of fixated on it, right? And we think, well, if I got that much this month, I'm going to see if I can 10x it for the next quarter, right? And then it doesn't come, and this is Boethius' point too, isn't it, right? And then we're angry that we've been cheated, even though the original thing was an act of generosity, right? The fact that we live in a wealthy country is just pure grace. But it doesn't mean it's going to be like this forever. I mean, other countries have been wealthy and collapsed, right? Other countries are poor right now. It's gonna change, right? The sort of situation and factors of history are going to move, and political parties are going to collide into each other and weaken and vitiate their own countries. And when no leadership, things will just fall to pieces, and that just happens. And other places rise up, and so I think Dante sort of sees it, almost feels to me has a sort of like Franciscan flavor to it, right? Um, like that Lady Fortune is also kind of, I don't know, borrowing a little bit from the playbook of Lady Poverty, right? It's all good, right? It's all blessing. And I'm just spreading it around, and your goal is to, I mean, you said earlier temperance, and I like that, but then to also maybe think in an Augustinian way. Your goal is to see things iconically, right? Your goal in the meal is for the communion of the people around it, in addition to the nourishment, right? But it's not just the consumption of the calories, but it's a chance of a higher level, an emergent good of say togetherness. And analogously with these goods, right? Your goal is to see them iconically, right? Your goal is to see them as enriching people's hearts, and that's wealth well used if it enriches people's hearts. But we have to sort of see through it. I've got an icon hanging over my shoulder, right? But there are these sort of two-dimensional things which we're almost meant to look through as a type of window and sort of think our way into this third dimension. So I think these, I guess another way to put it is that these souls that we've just encountered weren't able to think iconically, or maybe even better, refused to think iconically about the things in their lives because they wanted to just sort of lock them down as their personal quantitative possessions, which they could count and hold forever, right? Even though that's not what they were for. They were just meant as a sign, maybe as a way, as a vehicle, as a path for these richer and greater goods, which is exactly Virgil's speech in this, right? Woe to men who do not appreciate those goods, which when they are divided, everyone becomes richer, right? Incredible, right? If you have $100 and 100 friends and you divide it among them, you get richer every time, you get poorer every time you divide it, right? You go from 100 to 1. But there are some goods and their loves and their virtues, things like passion and compassion and solidarity, and maybe even love of fine things, of music, of literature, of humility, and the cheerful love of poverty and chastity and service. These are types of things that the more people who share in these wealths, the wealthier everyone feels. And this is the sort of fun paradox. These are the types of wealth objects which, when divided, are multiplied. And I think that's also sort of inherent in Dante's rewrite of Boethian material stuck in Virgil's mouth in this canto, right?
Yeah, no,
A
very
real
good.
fortune.
Yeah, I like the reference to inexhaustible goods, right? So not the thing like you mentioned the dollars, or sometimes they always talk about like the pieces of pie, right? It's an exhaustible good. There's only so much that can be shared, but there's also things like justice or truth or beauty. Insofar as you having justice doesn't mean justice is denied to me. We continue to share, and these are really actually, I think, more of the higher common goods that build a
Right.
really healthy culture.
Right.
So yeah, I just think what Dante's done here to Lady Fortune is really beautiful. That he's kind of moved her
Mm,
from being maybe something that's even contrary to the virtuous life, or something that's always tempting you in the virtuous life, to here she is this. I liked your analogy of the girl just picking flower petals, because almost how he presents her. She does not care.
right.
She's not tied into these things, and Providence uses her to distribute goods as Providence wills. And so yeah, she's an
Yeah.
angel. She's a messenger. Uh,
Yeah. In Boethia, she's like the bad girl who was already cheating on you, even though she knew you were in love with her. And she's just delighted when you discover that your relationship has been a sham for the past 6 months, right? That's Boethius, uh, Lady Fortune. But yeah, no, I think this one is very angelic, right? Um, it's almost like a lower level of the primum mobile, but the sort of you could almost call her. This will start to sound kind of weird, but yeah, she's almost like the angel of history. The angel of sort of like the distribution of the wealth of nations, right? Like, why do some countries get geniuses born among them who create these like fabulous opportunities and wealth, right? How does that happen? And it seems like for Dante, I mean, I think obviously we're in a different economic and political world, and I mean, the whole modern enterprise, as Machiavelli himself says, is taking fortune by the hair and pulling her, right? We think that we've created an economic system in which we no longer will ever lose domination of the flow of wealth, right? That might be an interestingly wrong supposition, but we don't have to cover that there. But going all the way back to Dante, right, who doesn't have the laws of economics and political theory or whatever, right? He has some, but I mean, he's not an economist, obviously. That doesn't live in a modern economy. Just sort of sees these things of just sort of sprouting up and going, right? But you're right. I think there's a good feeling to it. It's all in a major key. It feels
I
generous.
I really
Like,
appreciate
here's
you.
your opportunity to love something even better.
No, go
Just
ahead.
going back to my example, I mean, you can imagine some weirdo, right? Like, like the little girl tossing her flower petals, and you get a couple in your hand, right? Well, of course, what you love about that is the more beautiful thing of her innocence, right? It's the higher level good, that her innocence and her joy, and the flowers are merely an icon, a symbol of that higher level. But what a weirdo, right? If you gathered up the flower petals and said, "3, I want more," right? And so I think for Dante to have that type of disposition, and again, I feel this very sort of Franciscan. I can think of some really cool poems by Jacopone da Todi, right, the Franciscan poet, who makes it onto my top 5 list of underappreciated poets of all time. But Jacopone da Todi, I feel like, is lurking under a lot of these scenes of this joyful, exuberant, overflowing heart.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate you mentioning Machiavelli, because I think that's just the capstone on this, is to look at how Lady Fortune has moved through the great books, right? Right? We talk about the great books being in conversation with one another, that there's this great conversation we can join. You see how Boethius presents Lady Fortune. You see how Dante then kind of perfects her into an angel. And then we'll see how Machiavelli, yeah, as you mentioned, basically uses rape language.
Turns her
This
into a prostitute, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
she's no longer this servant of providence that we receive goods
right.
from, but rather she's someone that we can dominate. And I think that's the mindset, as you've mentioned, right? That's the mindset then that moderns have when we approach fortune.
Yes,
So no, I think that
yes.
rounds it out really well, and I appreciate that. So let's look at the fifth circle. One thing to mention here is the pace is very quick here at the beginning, right? We're getting 2 circles even in one canto. And so, what's the fifth circle? Who's here, right? We're still in this like upper hell, incontinence. So who's here? Well, they come to a river, right? The river Styx. And for those of us who worked through our Homer in a year, right, we'll remember the river Styx. This is the river that the gods would make oaths on. This is the river that Achilles was dipped into. So we get the river Styx. And what do we see here? There's at first glance, there's all these angry souls that are just obviously angry. That's wrath, right? That's the sin that's here is wrath, and they're just kind of, and honestly, the way he describes the river is it's less of a river and more almost akin to the gluttons, right? It's like a mud. It's like a slime.
It's a mud pit.
Yeah, and so they're all just kind of thrashing in anger in this. But then as you kind of look closer, there's this other group of souls.
Nice.
They're just kind of like, percolating underneath the surface. They're not moving a whole lot. Dante can see kind of the bubbles coming up to the top. And these are, right, this is acedia. This is the slothfulness. And so I think, again, right, we're getting these comparisons between 2 sins of an excess and a defect. So we see this wrath, right, this kind of excess of zeal. And then we're also, though, seeing this acedia, right, a lack of zeal, a cooling of the love. We had a good conversation in our first episode of kind of the hints that Dante the poet gives us in the first canto, that Dante the Pilgrim is suffering from acedia. He's lost in the woods. He's halfway through his life. He doesn't know how he's got there. And so here we see, I think, wrath and acedia contrasted with one another.
Yeah.
You had not to put you on the spot, but you had a really wonderful little analog that I had not seen anywhere else. You had it in your beginner's guide, that Dante first sees Styx as this spring, like this small kind of spring that's bubbling up, that then becomes this large river with all these wrathful souls. And you kind of gave a really marvelous picture of why that was an analog or an icon of the problem with this sin. Do you mind leading us through that?
Yeah. Yeah, just this idea of sort of wrath pooling up, right? I mean, Aquinas, again, Aquinas says that it's possible to sin by not being angry enough. Isn't that interesting? And we might sin in that way a lot as moderns. But what that means is that the passion of wrath, the passion of anger, is essentially a good thing. It is the desire to obtain the difficult good, or the disappointment, sorrow, and sadness of the obstacles in our way between us and the difficult good, right? The athlete experiences. I mean, we love watching this with athletes, right? On the Nike commercials where they're lifting heavy weights and beating themselves with medicine balls and the abs, right? Like, what we love about that is that they've committed themselves to a difficult good, even if it's kind of on a low plane of goodness, but nevertheless, it's good, right? And so, I mean, it's possible to, okay, that's just a sort of natural kind of function or operation of the human soul. But then Aquinas, as soon as he says that, he starts talking about how hard it actually is to do what our Lord says, to sin, or what does he say? Be angry without sin, right? That it's theoretically possible and it's practically incredibly difficult because all these other things begin to creep in, right? Like maybe I began to mainly get angry, not because it was an injustice, but because it was an insult to me personally, right? Don't they know who I am? Don't they know what I've done for them? And obviously, as parents, we feel this almost every single day, right? I mean, the amount of time I've labored and the money I put in, right? I don't want to repeat anyone's living room conversation from 2 hours ago, right? But I mean, that's not good anymore, right? That's an anger that's beginning to sort of bleed off in this kind of icky way, right? If it begins with something which is a clean fire, but it sort of, tears something in the soul in the meantime, and it begins to sort of bleed and pull up in this kind of dark, icky, colonized spot, right? I think that's the sort of image I was thinking, that the cleanness of our anger is hard to keep, right? The cleanness of our I mean, it turns so easily into this kind of sinful, infected stuff. And not just that, it pulls up, right? You get angry at you get passed over in a promotion for the position that you were obviously better qualified for, right? And you begin to sort of build resentment. But anytime that's touched, it comes out again, and it bleeds a little bit more. It trickles down into the soul, and pretty soon your soul is a swamp of of unforgiven people, right? Whose careers you do not want to see flourish. It can get nasty in a hurry, and I think it just sort of pools and it sort of collects like this disgusting swamp. It's scary.
Yeah, no, very good. What's interesting too here is that we're coming to it, but we haven't really got the full picture of the structure of hell. We've kind of had these hints at what it is. We had the three beasts that we kind of looked at and said, are these kind of a foreshadowing of a structure? So what's interesting here, though, is that one of our theses that we had was, okay, well, there seems to be incontinence, the sins of incontinence. Then there seems to be violence. So we had like the she wolf, and then we have the lion, and then there seems to be like treachery or fraud, and that's the leopard. So one thing that's kind of interesting here to note, that in talking about wrath in the area of upper hell of incontinence, is that this is a wrath that takes hold of this soul and they lose control of it. But it's not necessarily translating in them to violence.
That's right.
We're going to see those souls lower down. So this is interesting because this is like because
yes,
we actually feel like, I think, is like, to have a moral read, we tend to feel like we handle anger well as long as it doesn't like manifest into some kind of violence. But these people that like, this wrath is just churning inside them. They're sitting
as long
there
as it trickles down and stays in the swamp and no one else knows about it, I'm good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to go to what you observed, right? There's the small trickle that they observe here is the small wound, and that small wound becomes this giant river. But as long as it's just churning inside us and it doesn't actually translate, to being mean, it's okay. And I really think Dante is calling that out here. Like, no, you're constantly putting your soul, right, and because that's what we see. This contrapasso is it's chaotic. All these wrathful souls, it's not as violent as we'll see below, but it's just a chaotic. They're all angry, and then there's like the slothful ones that are just kind of getting beaten underneath the surface, right? But it is a distinct sin, and I think it's a little bit more refined than we're used to talking about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess you could say maybe the difference between the wrathful here and the violent that we'll encounter is that they didn't use their reason to guide their instincts, to cleanse their instincts, to think through their instincts, and to teach their emotions. Trained sentiment is what Lewis calls it, an abolition of man, right? Is the goal of old education. Whereas below, the violent use those irascible appetites and sort of motivate them and incentivize them in order to achieve evil things, right? So I think you're right. They're intemperate, and they don't correct it. They don't ever apply the sifting tool of reason to their natural instincts and cleanse it, right? But lower down, they take that and say, now utilize it, now weaponize it, and that's those are the violent who misuse their irascible appetites or motivate their irascible appetites to achieve goods they want, as opposed to merely letting a fire of the soul intemperately flame up and not translating it, purifying it into clean anger. And anyone who's known clean anger, I think it's a very rare experience. But every once in a long, long while, if you're a teacher or a parent, you realize that you've said just the right thing. And it might be some hard words, it might be some tough words, it might be like a real demand of the of those who are in your charge. but you know you didn't say it for yourself to make yourself look good. You didn't say it because you were wounded. You said because you're trying to correct a cosmic injustice and to deal medicinally with those with whom you're interacting. And it can happen. Clean anger. What I think is super fascinating, though, this Filippo Argenti, here's what I say in the note. Filippo Argenti, a member of the Adamari family, had a reputation for vanity and arrogance in his day, and it certainly plays out here. He belonged to the Black Guelfs, and his faction was responsible for exiling Dante's White Guelfs. There are even some early commentators who suggest that Filippo's brother was the one who took over Dante's Florentine property after his exile. This is the guy who didn't just get your job, but bought your house from you. This is the guy who ruined you. And Dante sees him here and just... So it's really weird that Virgil praises him. And it's very strange, and it doesn't feel like a very Christian reaction. It doesn't feel like Virgil was made to memorize the Beatitudes in school. I guess he studied Homer at school, or not the Beatitudes, right? But I think, at least in my read that I try to develop in the beginner's guide, is that ultimately human virtue is like a fugue, like a complicated Bach fugue with all kinds of melodic lines and scales and chords going in different directions and interacting. And one of the things that the classical pagan Virgil can understand is righteous indignation, right? Shame on you, you dog, right? For committing such an act of theft, right? Or, or your family, right? And your vain, arrogant family. I can recognize that and call it what it is. It seems like at least one of the things that Dante thinks we have to have is a sense of righteous indignation. We've already talked about how difficult that is, but a sense of righteous indignation which comes from a recognition of injustice. But I don't think it's the only thing that Dante thinks that his pilgrim will have to acquire. And so I think in a way he's sort of like been successful in a unit quiz, but there will be other unit quizzes that he'll also have to be successful at. And I don't think Virgil knows all of them. I think Virgil is pretty darn good, but I think the closer he gets to the center of the earth, well, the less experience he has down there, as he himself explains. But also I think the less he understands the mysteries of the Trinitarian God who made this place. And so I think for those who are puzzled by it, it seems like Dante, through the mouth of Virgil, is able to acknowledge a thing that we should have, a sense of indignation. But I do not think it's the end of the story, and Dante will have to add in some other more complicating, harmonizing chords, not all of which Virgil can supply.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, kind of pushing in there into Canto 8, crossing the river Styx in the city of Dis. Yeah, I think one way to look at it, in the way that I've read it, is that we understand that Dante the Pilgrim has to undergo his own formation, right? So the pilgrimage that he's undertaken is for his own good. He has to have a certain maturation. And we've seen him, there's things that he lacks. He lacks courage. Virgil's kind of critiqued him for that. We also see that we're not really sure if his will is aligned to the divine will, because he pities some of the souls here in hell, right? You think about in the the second circle with lust, right? He kind of falls into the trap of that seductress, and he pities her, and then he swoons. And so I think that in a certain way here, what Virgil's praising, or the way I read it, is that when Dante seems to delight in the punishment of the damned, from Virgil's pagan eyes, and that's something I appreciate you said that, because we have to understand, it's like a Platonic dialogue, right? We have to understand where the lesson is coming from, right? Who is the interlocutor that's actually telling us this lesson, because that we have to contextualize it properly. That Virgil then praises this because Dante is actually aligning his will more with the divine, that this soul does receive punishment. And what's interesting here, I think actually the most challenging verse or line, I guess, in this is that I think it's easy to say, well, Dante's formation is not complete, right? It's incipient. So he's got to go all the way through hell, but then he also has to go through purgatory, and then he has to go through paradise. And so it's premature to say that his delight here is technically the right thing to do. But I think what's really fascinating is that there's a line in there where Dante says that he still feels delight. Dante the poet says he still feels delight even to this day, which means that he's already gone through, as he makes that comment, he's already gone through the Inferno and Purgatorio and the Paradiso. And he
Exactly.
still delights in the punishment of that damned. And so I think there's something here that it may be unsettling to us as moderns, that we see Dante the Pilgrim starting to align his soul, or his soul really, but his will with the divine will. And part of that alignment is that the damned are where they should be, that it's an act of justice that the damned are suffering in this contrapasso.
Yeah. And shortly after that, I saw the mangling inflicted on him by the mud-dwelling people, and still I praise God for what I saw and thank him. Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable line, and contemporary secular Dante professors at universities have a terrible time. Have a terrible time getting through this. But I think, like I said, I think there's no way around it but to think that, like, look, I mean, Dante's from a medieval chivalric warrior culture, right? He believes that it's just if you get punched to punch back hard. And if your enemy yells in pain, that is a good thing, provided that it's, an act of justice, right? And provided that you have the right disposition, this chivalric courtly disposition, right? So I think, however much we might wish to refine it, that's why I'm just sort of stating the sort of like lowest common denominator, to believe that there's some type of sense of righteous indignation which is actually necessary for a soul, right? To not just to sort of like not be, not do bad things, but to loathe it, right? To have your stomach churn in the presence of it. That's actually a necessary part of the moral formation in Dante's mind, right? I mean, being good for Dante is not being bad.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Dante, I think one reason that it grates against us as moderns is that Dante is thoroughly a pre-liberal, right? He doesn't have some of the presuppositions that we have in our culture of, tolerance and these kinds of things. You said earlier, which I agree with, that we talk about the wrathful a lot, but really, which one do we see more in our culture? That there's an excess of that anger, on an anger that we should have, and there's an excess of it, or is there a lack of that anger? I would say actually in our current culture, there's a lack of righteous anger. Right, we're very slow to get angry, even about the things that we should become angry about. Right, we've kind of been habituated to cool that and to bridle that in us, right? So just do whatever you want. Be a Catholic. Don't be a Catholic. Go do whatever you want to do in your life. Just don't be overly serious about it, right? Don't let zeal consume you. Just kind of like curb these things. And so, yeah, I think Acedia, there's a wonderful book called The Noonday Devil, and by Archbishop Nolt, I believe, or Abbot Nolt. And it's a historical treatise or treatment of acedia, how the early church fathers saw it, the desert fathers, and how we kind of lost track of what it really meant, as we called it slothfulness, and we thought it was laziness. But he really presents it there really beautifully as this like cooling of love, which really matches some of the lessons that Virgil gives really well on the terraces of purgatory. So I think that we talk about where are these sins like in our own culture. When we see Dante like delighting in the punishment, I think there's something as moderns that grates against us a little bit. But this is where Dante, the teacher, I think can kind of help us align our own souls in a certain way.
Yeah.
So let's push into Canto 9, kind of the coming of the angel and the city of Dis. I think you used the phrase that the city of Dis is the antechamber of lower hell. I appreciated that. So we're kind of coming to understand that hell it's conical. It's this spiraling downward. The rings of hell, these circles are becoming smaller. And the city of Dis now is going to be a demarcation for us between upper hell and lower hell. But one of the problems they immediately run into, right, is that they're barred. The city of Dis won't let them through. And we get all these creatures, which I think it's really interesting that all the creatures are kind of like half beast, half animal creatures. It's like Medusa, it's the
Mm-hmm.
Furies. I think there's harpies. There's all
Mm-hmm.
these kind of like humanoid but kind of bestial
Mm-hmm.
creatures that
Mm-hmm.
won't let them in. And it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting because Virgil gets frustrated, and because we've seen several times already in the Inferno, in which someone will say you can't go any further or you can't do this, and Virgil will kind of stand up and chastise them, and then they're allowed to go on their way. But here, I think what's really interesting is that Virgil can't complete it. He can't complete the journey. There's something about the
Mm-hmm.
city of Dis that Virgil, which we've been kind of tracking as an analog to human reason, can't complete the journey, and he has to wait for a divine act. He has to wait for grace, right, for this angel to come. What do you think Dante the poet is trying to teach us here?
Yeah. Yeah. And Dante, ask us to focus in on this moment, right? He says, reader, this is I don't know if you have the lines in front of you, right? But reader, I am doing something of extraordinary importance here, and you've got to sort of pull back the veil to see to see the secret meaning behind my strange verse or something like
Yeah,
that,
he
right?
says that there's a hidden.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, he says, according to your translation, it says, "O you with intellects healthy and sound, look
Hmm.
hard for the teaching that's hidden beneath the veil of my extraordinary verse." And this is obviously Dante the poet, speaking to us. And he
Yeah.
does this as a preamble
Right.
to the coming of the angel, because then the tercets that
Hmm.
follow are actually some of my favorite in all the Inferno, because he paints this
Me too.
beautiful picture of all of hell trembling as this angel
Yeah.
comes kind of streaming down
I think that's the part of
into
my book
hell.
I'm the most proud of, honestly.
Really?
Yeah. So if people listening want to get the book, I mean, just read that Canto 9, and then you can send it back to Amazon. You'll have got it, right? I think it's my favorite part right after this. But so here's what I think's going on. Okay. Medusa comes up. So the Furies are up there, and Virgil just says, "Hey, look at the Furies. Watch out for those girls. They're really bad, right?" But then they say, "Let Medusa come, let Medusa come." And I tried to put it in this weird kind of incantatory magical kind of language, which I feel that I hear in the Italian. And then Virgil freaks out. They want to turn him to stone. And then it pauses in those lines that Deacon Garlick just read, right? Hey, reader, look beneath these extraordinary verses. And then comes the angel. So I think what's going on here is that we got to remember is that in the Aeneid, book 6, this is exactly where the journey of Aeneas stalled with the Sibyl. The Sibyl brought him up to the gates of Tartarus, which is where the truly evil and wicked, the infamously evil, are kept in Virgil's imagination. And the Sibyl said, "You can't go in there. You can't see any of that stuff. It's not for pure eyes. We're going to continue on our way to the Elysian fields. I can describe to you some of the things that you could see in there." And then she goes away. So now we've come to the moment where the poet Virgil had walked away. Now, the character Virgil tries to get in and is unsuccessful. He can't get into these sort of like deep things where the sort of like deepest possible evils dwell. And he's sort of, and he's impatient. He knows he needs divine assistance, but he's not exactly sure when it will come. There's like a suggestion that he might think it might not come, that they might have been abandoned, right? And then when it does come, it's an extraordinary moment in Dante's poetry, kind of like we were talking about earlier, in which is this mix of registers, the high and the low. It's frogs. I even went so bold as to translate snake as water moccasin in this section. And anyone who's grown up in the South, like, immediately has a sort of embodied like experience of heebie-jeebies, right, for that. But it's this incredible embodied experience in which, again, Dante ranges from the high to the low, right? From the humble to the sublime in a single passage, in this huge, roiling hurricane of divine energy which comes powering through, right? It's sublime discourse, which blows away in terms of its linguistic range anything Virgil had ever done, at the very moment that the classical hero Aeneas had to walk away. And I think what's happening is that we have both a sort of ethical demand that you want to be a Christian, deal with it. You're going to have to kick open the doors and you're going to have to go all the way down to the root of the human heart. And you're going to have to discover, right, those things which have been frozen, right? Those warm affections that very draw to God, which you've forgotten by being drawn to the periphery of your life. You're going to have to go in there and deal with all the muck and the brokenness and the inherited issues that define your life. The Christian poet, the Christian's hero has to go down, and the Christian poet has to come up with a language which begins with Virgil and then stretches it on either end, right? He sort of, begins with Bach, and all of a sudden you feel it's turning into Liszt, right? He's going all the way up and all the way down, the treble clef and the bass clef, and then combining it in this incredible, transcendent, sublime passage of poetic energy. Because this is grace, right? This is grace coming from on high to help us achieve the deepest possible depths. So I think it's just such an incredibly fun passage because there's so many cool things happening here, right? One, the Christian poet is now supplanting the wonderful but pagan poet. The Christian understanding of Augustine had said that the pagans were laudable because they had seen the blessed isle from a high view, but they were too proud to go down. And thus Augustine himself developing in a Christian way upon this neat Neoplatonic paradox, right? The way up is the way down. And ultimately, right, if we could just sort of imagine Dante's world, right, as we sort of go down and down and down and down, we get, to Antarctica, right? And then go up and up and up and up, and then keep going up into heaven, but it's all linear. Even though it feels like descent now, it's actually part of an ascent, absolutely speaking, from a wider purview. And so I think there's all these incredible moments. It has ethical implications. It has psychological implications. It has poetic and linguistic implications. And I think it's my favorite canto. Since you're only interviewing me for this one section, I can just boldly say that. If there would be others, I'd have to be more cautious because I'd probably say it like 7 more times. But I think Inferno 9 is something really, really special. And I think it all has to do when we realize if we can understand what this threat of freezing the heart is all about, and if we can understand the very limits of the Virgilian world, where the Virgilian world came and turned back, and now the Christian comes and says, this is where we have to go down. The way up is the way down. And like I said, psychological, ethical, spiritual, mystical, poetic implications all folded into one magnificent canto.
Very beautiful. Yeah, I really appreciate what you said there, is seeing this really kind of maybe as that step, moving from a paganism to a Christianity, of reason to faith, of nature to grace. I really appreciate that, particularly here, drawing in Virgil and his Aeneid, understanding kind of like this lesson that we're getting in these poetic terms, these signs that we might not be familiar with if we're not familiar with all of the backstory that he's playing with here. I think another thing that occurs to me, on a more mundane note, not a large architectural note, is notice that all the characters that we've been introduced to are all giving us different examples of anger. So we didn't really talk about him, but there was the boatman, and he's angry. He's angry at Virgil, and he's angry at Dante. And then we have Virgil, and he gets angry about the city of Dis and that he can't make it through. Dante gets angry, maybe in a right way, but we get another example of anger at the damned soul. The Furies. So on the podcast, we actually just worked through the Oresteia. So we're painfully aware of the Furies, right? These kind of vengeful female deities that are really kind of horrible and horrendous to look at. That really, their violence, their satiation, their desire for blood really fuels this blood avenger model, right? We see them pursuing Orestes. So they're kind of like wrath incarnate almost. But then the angel is angry. The angel comes down and he gives, one of the, I think, best speeches when he comes down and talks about, why do you kick out against providence? Why do you have this pride? because really you're nothing. This angel comes down and they all scatter. The line
You've
about the
done this
frogs.
before. Yeah.
The line about the frogs too. You're right. It's a different register. It's very colloquial, but it also is so demeaning. So we move from like, oh my gosh, Medusa's coming and this would be terrible and Virgil's afraid, to now all these things being compared to like these little amphibians that just jump out of the way. In the midst of something that comes that's actually a little bit more real than everything around it. The angel is presented as something more real. And we didn't, one of the things that we didn't talk about, but like a small detail, right? When Dante gets on the boat, it's the only time the boat then shows any type of weight. Dante is somehow more real than what all the rest of hell is composed of, and we see that in text. I think we see an antecedent of it in Homer when Athena gets on the chariot. It groans under her weight. She's somehow much more real than even the men around her. And then, kind of like most famously, C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce plays off this heavily. Right, the damned souls go to heaven, and these shades can't even bend the grass. Actually, the grass hurts them because they can't even bend it. So it's this really poetic, beautiful picture that evil's not really a real thing, right? Evil's actually a privation of the good. It's like that darkness isn't real. Darkness is simply an absence of light. The cold's not really real. It's simply an absence of heat. And so, you could have all heat or all light. You don't have to have cold or darkness, just like you can have something that's all good, but you can't ever have anything that's all evil because it's a lack. It's like a hole in the ground. And so there's like these little pictures that Dante the poet gives us, these little catechetical lessons. And yeah, the angel coming down, I think, is probably one of the best.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that's also a cool transition into Canto 10. And these souls, we know that they're Epicurean. They denied the immortality of the soul. And one's a famous politician, Farinata. I think I call him in the notes the George Washington of Florence, right? He's a magnanimous hero. He not only got his Ghibellines, his imperial supporting Ghibellines to win a battle and fight back in and take Florence, but then he magnanimously opposed opposition in his own party to completely destroy the Guelfs and erase the bad guys forever, right? Change the voting laws so that the bad guys will never win again, right? That's sort of temptation of the victor. Farinata opposed that. He's a really magnanimous guy. But it's always sort of struck me that his first question of Dante is, who are your ancestors? Whose team were you on? Republican or Democrat? It's like, not like, hello, my name's Jason. May I have your name? Like, Republican or Democrat? And so he sort of immediately moves into this type of mode. But he's also talking about politics, which were, playing out when Dante was just a kid, right? And so it's almost like, meeting someone at a cafe, an older person who buttonholes you and says, yeah, but you don't understand the Carter years. Like, yeah, that's true, right? I don't understand, what it felt like the Jimmy Carter years. But Farinata is sort of fixated on this period of history, right? And you really get the impression that he'd love to continue this conversation with Dante forever. And they would just sort of duke it out, and Dante would set forward his Guelph politics and say, yeah, well, my people were able to return and they've kept your Ghibellines. But he's like, well, yeah, but, and he'd be really delighted to have this conversation forever. That there was this moment of history in which the politics were intense, and he was intense, but the man who denies the immortality of the soul can't see beyond those 40 years of his activity. And that is what he is sort of continually fixated on day in and day out. Like, you'd sort of imagine him down there in the tomb, right? Going through his memoirs again, like, oh yes, January 17th, right? And rereading it. And in the meantime, the father of Dante's poet friend, the poet friend being Guido Cavalcanti, here, Cavalcanti, is shocked that Dante is here and his son Guido is not. he says, look, if you are led by your intellect, where's my Guido? He was one of the most talented people of his generation. And they don't seem to know who Virgil is. And they don't seem to recognize, in some sense, the miraculous. Well, they haven't heard the angel. They don't know all these things. Their sort of focus on life is so narrow, right? In these couple of decades and these couple of loves, that they become fixated on these things and can't see this wider picture of supernatural interaction. Both, I guess you could say, both along the y-axis of sort of supernatural interaction, but also the depths of the soul, which has to be cleansed, but also just other sort of chronological things, right? Like reverence for the past. They're just sort of locked into these couple of decades in which they lived. And I think in that way, they're, though intense with respect to the fullness of history, well, the very fact that we don't know who they are anymore is sort of telling, right? They confine themselves to their couple of decades, right?
Yeah, no, very good. I appreciate that. Because I think one thing that's a little bit confusing, maybe to first time readers, or it was to me as I moved through this, is like, okay, so we're now in this we're now in lower hell, or we're getting there. We're kind of in the city of Dis. We have this circle of heretics, and immediately, like, I think of like, oh, like what early church heresy is Dante going to pull from? You think of like some of the Christological heresies. You think of some of the Christological heresies that basically split the empire. There's all these examples, and then how he kind of structures this, as I understand it, is that we basically have all these tombs. The lids are off. There's multiple souls shoved into these tombs, and each tomb kind of represents a particular heresy, and each one has its like arch heretic. And the one that we get, the arch heretic, is a pagan. Like that's a really interesting juxtaposition, right? Because and obviously that's an incredibly intentional choice. Again, I'm finding myself that reading Dante like I read Plato, where obviously he chooses these details intentionally, and could have chosen so many others. And so the way I read this is kind of, and I think your the way you just presented it, I think laid it out really well. But just to make it explicit, is that these, Epicurus, basically denies the immortality of the soul. And so these people he's talking to, it's not clear. I mean, some of them it is, but it's not clear that they explicitly denied the immortality of the soul. But it's very clear that they lived in such a manner that the soul, that they acted like the soul was not immortal, right? So just like all the politics, there was nothing on the horizon of the eternal. It was all the temporal. And even in hell, because in a certain way, I think there's a misread here, right? Like he's presented still very dignified. He seems to have, he doesn't even seem to show that he's suffering. And so I think there's a misread of like, oh, look, he's somewhat conquered hell, or he's still here. But really what you realize is that his intellect and his imagination is incredibly myopic. It's incredibly imploded
That's great.
on this, like what you said, right? This like 40-year stretch. So it's interesting that he uses this example, because I think it's a much more subtle critique of heresy that a lot more of us would actually be subject to, right? Oh yeah, well, I believe in the immortality of the soul. Yeah, but do you actually live your life like it? Well, no, I don't.
Yeah, I love that. I remember also just checking a date here. Farinata is talking about the battle, the Battle of Monteperti, which was fought in 1265, and so which is 5 years before before Dante's birth. 1260, which is 5 years before Dante's birth. So I mean, this is pick readers, listeners, pick your date 10 years before you were born, and imagining someone engaging you in passionate politics, right? I mean, for me, like the Jimmy Carter era, right? But for others, like, well, what did you think about Dwight Eisenhower's decision? And like, I don't know if I have a strong opinion on that. But I think it's really interesting too that now we're inside the gates of Dis, aren't we? And we're just about to get to the plains of the violent. And so you wonder too if there's almost a kind of psychological violence that the heretics committed against themselves, right? A kind of intellectual suicide. And I bet we all have friends like this. I have friends like this. People are so committed to one particular ideology, activist for certain causes, right? You could choose left or right, but activists for certain causes. I know some activists for well-known progressive causes who have committed themselves to a certain style of life and to a certain cause and have grown more and more unhappy as their lives continue, decades and decades and decades in the cause. But they've gained celebrity in the sort of progressive cause. They can't sort of disassociate themselves. But surely, 30 years and the type of misery you have reduced yourself to, surely there must be some sort of alarm bells or microwave dings going off in your brain that this is intellectually, this creed is shabby. This creed is shallow. It doesn't bring contentment and it doesn't bring happiness. And it seems in a way the sort of heretic commits violence against himself, sort of surgically removing those doubts. Nope, we're committed to the cause. And disengages from all possible dialectical engagement with the world. And so I think, I suspect that, well, it's really kind of a hypothesis, right? But I suspect that the heretics might be related to the violent in that way, or at least adjacent.
Yeah, no, I like that. I've seen it kind of presented as, heresy is like this kind of attempt to have violence against God in a certain way, trying to understand where heresy like fits into the structure. I think one of the things that's most interesting about this canto is how the damned understand time, which I thought was really brilliant, because the damned keep, so even in this canto, right, we see the damned are prophesying like, oh, well, this is what will happen to you, Dante, but then they don't know current events. And that's a really interesting thing. So they seem to not understand the present, but they can tell the future. And so Virgil gives this, somewhat horrifying depiction that, well, yes. So what ends up happening is that they understand the future. They understand then that this like judgment, this final judgment, like we talked about earlier, is coming. And they seem to understand things between now and then, but not the present. But then at some point, there won't be any temporal future anymore, right? There'll be a new heaven and a new earth. And then they'll just be stuck in this kind of like present, eternal unknowing, which is kind of a horrifying existential place to be, if you will. And so I don't know. It's really fascinating. I'd like to think about it more, about how he presents the damned like this, where they can give prophecies of the future, but they can't understand the present and kind of what the pedagogical purpose of that is.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know. I know that Dostoevsky magically creates that very experience at the beginning of his Dream of a Ridiculous Man, who shoots himself in the heart and dies, but is aware after death and sits in his tomb underground for who knows how many years. But I think something like that, I think that's a pretty spectacular vision. And that's what I always emphasize, is that, yeah, Dante's pretty medieval. He's got some, if you know the painter Hieronymus Bosch, right? He's got some Bosch in him, right? He's got some medieval stuff. But he also has this sort of new element of this sort of this in-tuned subtlety to psychological realities, and I think this is one of them.
Yeah, I think he's doing something very particular here, and like I said, I'd like to think more about it. Before we move on, we kind of bring to a close here on Canto 11. Can you just kind of give us like a high level sketch of these different political parties in Florence? Because there's like white and black, but then there's two larger groups. Can we just have like a high level sketch of them?
Sure. Yeah, I've got a couple of pages on this in my introduction to the translation. It's called Guelfs and Ghibellines and all that. But essentially, how far do we go back? Charlemagne. When Charlemagne in 800 AD gets crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope for his services against the Lombards, he is given sort of titular claim to Italy. And yet he goes back over the Alps and he continues to rule from north of the Alps. He divides his kingdom among his three sons. There's, sort of division of territory. But for a long, long, long time, those who in some sense passed down the paper documents of the titular claim to Italy, to being the Roman emperor, all lived north of the Alps. But this goes on for a couple hundred years, in part because there's division, because the Carolingian Empire collapses and it was replaced by others, and a new generation of the Hohenstaufen rise up, and Frederick Barbarossa in particular is really interested in renewing the titular claim of being the Holy Roman Emperor. And this begins a whole series within Dante's day, especially with Frederick II, who comes down to Sicily and creates a kingdom in Sicily. And Sicily has this kind of like incredible cultural flourishing moment in which it's multilingual and the court of Frederick II. But Frederick II is hoping, and his son Manfred helps his father. And Manfred shows up, and oh, by the way, Frederick II's among the heretics here. And Manfred will meet in purgatory. He's kind of like a unlikely convert. But they're starting to creep back into Italy, and slowly sort of fighting different sort of city-states who had grown accustomed to their own independence. Now, those city-states themselves are fighting each other. They're both worried about the emperors coming back in, and then they're also fighting each other. And so it creates this kind of like fractal of political alignments in which essentially you have the Pope and his new moneyed Guelph supporters. And you have the emperor and his old moneyed aristocratic nobled title Ghibelline supporters. The Pope, and so, but sometimes it'll go like city by city. And sometimes a whole city will sort of flip from Ghibelline to Guelph allegiances if Guelphs can get into the city and kick out the Ghibellines, and then the city flips. It's like a red-blue map, right? But sort of Italy is sort of, the cities are divided against themselves, jockeying for positions. The emperor is trying to come back up to Rome. The Pope is trying to keep him off. The Pope is using new moneylenders in order to purchase mercenaries to fight against the imperial forces, and also is trying to enlist the assistance of the French crown, which comes in. So when Charles Valois comes into Florence at the Pope Boniface's request as a peacemaker, he comes in and stamps out Dante's party, the White Guelfs, and a number of them are immediately sent into exile. He came in sort of ostensibly as a peacekeeper, but really takes these black Guelfs, who are the Pope's most fierce supporters, elevates them, and finally gives them their moment of power. But this is the kind of crazy kaleidoscope that's happening. But essentially, you can recognize it as two huge tectonic plates grinding against each other. The Pope, who had grown accustomed to engaging in practical political affairs in Italy, in a sort of absentee imperial government north of the Alps, Germanic blooded emperors who now want to claim that they are Caesar Augustus and want to enter back into Rome and unify the empire. And they have their old-fashioned aristocratic estate-owning, castle-owning, chivalric, Ghibelline supporters, kind of old money, imperial, new money, lenders, papal, but also French. These sort of present the big grid in which everything works. But then what's fascinating is that these sort of huge international politics get mapped into even local cities, such that old-fashioned family feuds, right, between long-standing families tend to get sort of pulled in the direction of Guelfs and Ghibellines. Or in the state of Florence, when the Florentines kick out the Ghibellines, Farinata's party, they still have some people who lean in the direction of some of those, aristocratic values, and so they become, right? So then you have this division into black Ghibellines and white Ghibellines. So in some sense, like, you have this two-party system which controls local politics and how you feel about your neighbor across the street. Don't we see this? Like, whatever political sign your neighbor stuck across the street, right? Like, of course, Of course Katie would put a sign up like that, right? And you have these sort of like local affairs being kind of pulled into these international affairs, and that's exactly what happens in Florence.
I really appreciate that. I appreciate you mapping that out, because I think that, what we've kind of said for first time readers is if the Florentine politics is somewhat of a stumbling block, I think there's a lot of other things that you can pull out of like your first read of the Inferno. But I also think that one of the things about this kind of like the political, I really like the idea of, the plates kind of grinding against each other, because Dante is going to have a lot to say about the relationship between the imperial power and the apostolic power, between the church and, state. There would be an anachronistic term, but the temporal power and the spiritual power. And again, I
Yeah.
think that he incorporates this into a religious conversation in ways as moderns that we are not familiar with, right? We are very much accustomed to separation of church and state. Religion does not have anything to do with the temporal. And for Dante, I think he's seeing this kind of fractured Italy. And so he's going to have a lot of commentary as we kind of move through the Inferno. And then particularly, if we go through, say, Purgatory as well, some of those passages are very explicit about the relationship. And he also wrote a whole book on politics as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in general, you could think of Dante as a Ghibelline leaning in his politics, and that he's an imperial supporter. He writes several letters to these Holy Roman emperors, these German, begging them, urging them to come into Italy and reestablish claim. He thinks that Italy is now this disgusting, overgrown like weed-infested place, whereas it used to be a garden. And so Dante's sort of Ghibelline leading, even though he does say, I had to become a party unto myself. So he thinks that he's sort of like above it all. But but Dante's sort of Ghibelline leaning, and obviously anti-papal, but because he thinks that the papacy is trying to meddle in political affairs and is thus actually in secular affairs, is thus actually making people worse. He has a very Franciscan vision, a spiritual Franciscan vision of what the papacy should be. He thinks that it should be radically apostolic and radically evangelical. And that I think he thinks that if the papacy looked like the Franciscan order, at least according to the spiritual Franciscans right after Francis, then the church would actually be efficacious, because the church would divest itself of its don't want to get into contemporary ecclesial questions, but if the church divested itself of all these properties that it owns, if defrocked bishops weren't paid off millions of dollars a year, if the church didn't have like fabulous investments and things, it wouldn't worry about those things. It would walk around in poverty like Francis with sandals, maybe. And then people would actually respect its claims that it would make to the spiritual world. That's sort of Dante's very sort of radical Franciscan spiritual take. And so he's kind of Ghibelline leaning and very pro-imperial.
No, again, I appreciate you mapping that for us, because I think that's going to give us a lot of ways to navigate a lot of these conversations. So again, I appreciate it. So let's end on Canto 11, where we finally get kind of
the easy one.
Well, we get the architecture of hell, right? So we finally we've kind of hinted at it. Dante the poet's hinted at it. We've kind of given some fill in the blank and filling in gaps here when we've talked about it. It gives some type of navigation. We kind of finally get this large picture, and so maybe I'll take the first foray into trying to understand this, and then I'd love to know your thoughts. So basically, how I take this from Virgil is that we see, as we've kind of already mentioned, that hell is structured in three major parts, right? And so we have the sins of incontinence, which we're attaching, to the she-wolf that we saw. Then you have this section of violence, which we attach to the lion, and then we see this section on fraud, which we attach to the leopard. And so you have three categories of sin, mainly expressed in two geographical locations of hell. So you have an upper hell, if you will, and then you have the city of Dis, right? Is that kind of demarcation? I like that, the antechamber of deep hell or lower hell. And so then lower hell is going to contain the violent and the fraudulent, right? And I think one thing that's really interesting, particularly as a first time reader, is, man, we're burning through the sins of incontinence quickly, right? So like circle one, that was limbo. That was the unbaptized, right? These are people, they're contrapasso. They have Dr. Jennifer Frey called it a garden party, right? They're having a garden party out by the castle. But they're deprived the beatific vision, right? They're actually deprived being able to actually
It's a
satiate and
depressed garden party.
right.
Yeah.
It's a garden party where everyone knows that there was a better party that they wanted to go to, but they don't get to go to.
Right.
So you get the unbaptized and the virtuous pagans, also virtuous Muslims, right? Dante's soteriology, I think, is really fascinating of who goes where. So we have limbo, then we had lust, and then gluttony is the third circle, and then the fourth circle, as we said, we had the hoarders and the spendthrifts, and now then we get wrath and acedia, and then we have the city of dis, and then we're going to get into violence, where we see that there's a violence against neighbor, a violence against self, and even a violence against God and nature. And then fraud is going to be very complicated. We're going to have, in the 8 circles, going to have 10 different like ditches, if you will, with
That's right,
with like 10 different types of maybe what you might call simple fraud. And then the 9th circle is going to have 4 major areas of complex fraud. So what, I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting, and maybe for first time readers, is when you think of like, hey, what sin is really bad? Like what sin is really bad? And you think, oh man, I think murdering someone would be really bad. But Dante puts, I mean, one of
not
my
as bad as photocopying a $20 bill and spending it for ice cream at your local grocery store.
Right. So one of the things that's really interesting here is that he puts fraud down at the very bottom. And so one of my favorite examples is that in the section on violence, you're going to have people that basically committed like genocide, right? You're going to have these like warlords, and they're in a less severe section of hell than those who engaged in flattery. Flattery is punished in the 8th circle because it is a species of fraud, right? You're lying to people. Any comments on like how Dante is actually structuring these sins? Like what's the actual like rationale for the actual architecture of hell?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's seemingly it's according to the natural appetites, according to Thomistic psychology, right? Of sort of the animal appetites are those incontinent sins. And then, of course, there you have irascible appetites, what Plato calls the thumatic, the sort of the desires of the chest, right? Which could be both sort of like strong love or courage, but then can be sort of misused in these and weaponized in these ways for violence. And then there are the rational appetites, the desire to use language, to find truth, and then to say something in a way which is compelling to others to see. So I think for Dante, that the striking thing, and he disagrees with Aquinas on this. The reason that the Ivy League political scientist who now works for the multi-billion-dollar whatever bad corporation and lies to the public about what's happening, right? The PR representative for Nice, if you've read Lewis's Hideous Strength, right? Or the PR representative for Egan Enterprises, if people are watching Severance. I think he thinks that's so wicked is because we are icon making and icon loving animals. Of course, we're language animals. We're rational animals. But Dante's a poet. He doesn't want to just say rational animals. We're also language-using animals. That means we don't just say things which are true, but we say things in a compelling sort of way, which also inspires hearts to long for things. And for the people who sort of muddy the intellectual waters so that you can't know what's true and can't love the sort of true thing, at least you know that the local chapter captain of your Hell's Angel biker gang is a debauched and violent man. you're not tricked or fooled by this, but you might be tricked and fooled by the PR representative for the corporation that's doing unethical things, right? Or for the world's most polluting corporation to say it's going to be carbon neutral within just 25 years. Those sort of things, and I'm not just in terms of politics and economics, right? Those are just funny examples that came to my head, right? But yeah, I think Dante thinks that the bad college professor who destroys in his students the ability to speak truth and to love truth and to have hearts which are full of passion for it, has secretly, like a fox, robbed them of something without them even knowing it. And so I think it's that sort of element of secrecy. Dante was very, as his great grandfather Cacciaguida says to him, "Hey Dante, you know what your poetic mission is? Where they itch, let them scratch." That's how Dante describes like a big part of his poetic mission. So Dante, this man who prides himself on his frank straightforwardness, I think despises this like disgusting like flattery of words in which we say, "Oh yes, of course that's right," right? Where we run fake searches and we have protocols, all these things invented, in order to achieve certain ends, but everyone pretending that it's not like that. I think Dante just despised that. I think he wanted to know what he was up against. He wanted to know what he's fighting, as opposed to these little snakes and foxes sneaking in and out, and as well as Jerian himself does, in just a couple of canti, presents the face of an honest man. "Hey man, how you doing?" Hiding the tail of a scorpion. Who are you actually? Just tell me who you are. Who are your ancestors? Let's do this, right? Who are you playing for? Now let's go. I think Dante just so sort of delightfully, frank and straightforward. I think he thought that was the sort of noble chivalric heroism, right, of a knight, because he's from an aristocratic family, so he thinks of himself as a knight, right? His great grandfather was knighted in the Crusades, so he thinks that his blood has been refined and nobled, right? And then a knight doesn't fight in the dark, right? A knight declares battle and fights in the open. Kill me or not, but at least we know what we're doing. So I think for Dante, I think all these sort of things, his poetry, his attachment not just to truth, because the poet doesn't just tell truth, but makes it burn with both heat and light, right? The poet is sun-like. He doesn't just illuminate, but he also warms. And anything less than that might not actually be an actual disclosure of truth. And so I think for Dante, those who make murky statements and smooth things and hide around and sneak around and make back deals and sell governmental offices and wink at each other on golf courses, it's just disgusting to him, right? Stop sneaking around. Stop cheating, right? Just come and tell me who you are. If you're a churchman, do you actually believe in Jesus Christ or not? Stop faking. Stop pretending. Declare your allegiance, and then we'll know what we're doing. I think that's how Dante felt.
Yeah, no, very well said. Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, just kind of going back to like just simply mapping hell, is one way to look at it is to make a distinction based off malice. So the sins of incontinence, right, the inability for you to control your appetites towards a good, are not really malicious. But the lower hell, right, lower hell is then, you can see it as, broadly speaking, the entire lower hell is dedicated towards malice. And so then you have violence, and then you have fraud. And so I think that, taking what you said,
malice being the desire to hurt someone, right? And you can hurt them in their body, or you can hurt them in in your words, in your mind, in controlling sociological situations. You're right. Both. Yes, exactly. Both. All of deep hell are malicious sins.
So one way, I think, to re-articulate some of the points that you made is that, when Dante's trying to categorize, okay, these sins of malice, like which one's more severe than the other one, Well, we're rational animals, and so there's certain things that we can do that are the same as the sensible animals or the non-rational animals, right? So like the lion can be violent, the tiger can be violent. There can be this violence, but what's really unique about man is that he's rational. And so you can kind of think about the higher the angel, the greater the demon, right? So the higher the power, when it's corrupted, the lower it falls. And so notice that when he puts that fraud down at the bottom, right? Even things like flattery and stuff like that, it's because it's a corruption of the human intellect, right? So the intellect's an appetite, it seeks truth. Our speech has the purpose, right? The teleology of speech, it's telos, is to convey what is true. And so there's something inhuman, there's something dehumanizing about us when we use our intellect, which you gave lots of different examples of, right? When we use our intellect to share a lie. There is no noble lie, right, in Christianity, because Christ is the truth. We have to share the truth. And so doing something that's contrary to our highest power, the intellect, that's corrupting our unique capacity for speech, and then is also in a certain way very uniquely anti-Christ, right? It is an anti statement against who Christ is. Christ is the truth, but I speak a lie. And when I speak a lie, I divorce another intellect from reality, right? So think about flattery. We're like, why is flattery wrong? Well, because when people get together and they're flattering each other and et cetera, they're divorcing intellects from reality around them, which causes them to have a false engagement with what's truly real. So I think Dante, I mean, obviously we're going to explore the rest of hell, but I think just as a preliminary note, because his structure can be kind of confusing to people, I think that he really is seeing that man is unique because of his intellectual capacity. And when he
Right.
corrupts it,
Right.
uh,
Right. Yeah, just the whole flattery thing. Remember, this is not telling, Aunt Betsy that she looks good in those green shoes. Right. And this is like the intent to harm. Now, but if you're trying to get into Aunt Betsy's will and exclude all of your siblings, and you tell Aunt Betsy that her green shoes look great on her over and over again, now we're talking about sort of manipulating reality to harm people. Yeah.
yeah, there's that malicious element, right, that has to be there.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, no, very
Exactly.
good. Well, that brings us to the last canto. I mean, anything else that you think we missed, or anything else that you want to add at this juncture?
Oh, this is great. This is super fun. I
Good.
hope
Well,
that
we
I
really
hope that
appreciate you.
the listeners like it as much as I have.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think this is a beautiful journey as we kind of go through the Inferno, and not simply something that's there for our intellect or like in an academic way, but something where I think Dante the teacher is really inviting us to beautify our souls. Right? He's really inviting us to configure ourselves to Christ, showing the various lessons that are in the Inferno.
Yeah.
Um,
Or he will eventually.
yeah,
He's got to use the rock hammer first. Or as I've been putting it recently with my students, Inferno is the act of discreation. Inferno is sort of like running the 7 days of creation back, melting human souls into this sort of like pure plasma a second after the Big Bang. And then it can be reformed into something which is beautiful. But we've got to encounter the fear of the Lord first. And that's what the Inferno is.
yeah, very well said. Where can people find more about you and your work?
I have a website, jasonmbaxter.com, and I have my books, and I sell my books off the website, and I sign them for people. And I've discovered that people like are excited about the signature, but what they're like thrilled about is I just grab sort of like random lecture notes that I give to my students and like wrap my books in them, and people like those lecture notes. That was so cool that like I guess Jeff Bezos doesn't wrap books from Amazon and lecture notes. So jasonmbaxter.com if you're interested in my books. And then I have a Substack called Beauty Matters, and I write about a lot of academic things, but on my Substack, it's more sort of cultural engagement.
Oh, very good. Well, Dr. Baxter, we really appreciate you being here this evening.
Thanks. It's been a delight.
All right, everyone. Next week, we continue our journey through the Inferno. We are discussing Cantos 12 through 17 with Father Thomas, a Cistercian priest. It's going to be a wonderful episode. So I hope you guys will join us as we continue to read through the Inferno. Please visit thegreatbookspodcast.com, where we have lots of guides to guide you through other great books like the Iliad or the Odyssey. And we will see you all next week. Thank you.